I had like an accident. I had a fall. It was dreadful. I had like brain bleeding on the brain and a lot of breakages in my pelvis. So I had to lie flat for about 10 weeks until I could move again. And then they put me into a German rehabilitation center which was very good. Actually, I went with all the stroke people, but I went through lots of thinking and introspection, and basically with 10 weeks lying flat on your back gives you, and just barely surviving, because that was also, I was 10 days in an induced coma. It's kind of like, it sort of like focuses your attention on something that is worthwhile doing, how you can have a life that could potentially be worthwhile. I didn't know how good my recovery would be. I'm very lucky that I made it as far as I made it and have almost no lasting effects. So, but I did think that at that time that I really wanted to do something for patients. PROs are patient-reported outcomes. Right. That means that they are the way that a patient feels after they've been receiving a treatment for a certain amount of time. And COAs are clinical outcomes assessment. Patient-reported outcomes are a type of clinical outcomes assessment. There are other types such as
We spent billions of pounds developing new drugs. We put thousands of patients through clinical trials, and yet one fundamental question remains. Are we truly measuring what matters most to patients, and are we doing that in the most effective way possible? Katja nearly died at 18 due to an accident that caused a brain hemorrhage. She spent 10 days in a coma. That experience crystallized her life's work, ensuring patients have a voice in drug development. The challenges really are profound. How do you measure suffering in patients who can't articulate their experience? In cultures where expressing pain isn't acceptable. The field has developed thousands of questionnaires, yet knowing which ones to use and when remains complex. There are real trade-offs. More comprehensive measurements increase trial complexity and cost. The incentive structures across regulators, payers, and industry don't always align perfectly with capturing the full patient experience. Technology offers promise, like electronic PROs who could capture richer data, but adoption faces practical barriers. There's tension between what's scientifically ideal and what's pragmatically achievable in the current system. I set out to understand the machinery of pharmaceutical development, the real constraints everyone faces, and how we can meaningfully advance patient-centered outcomes research. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Katja. Thank you for coming today, Katja. I really appreciate you taking the time to get onto the podcast with me. Really appreciate it. I'm going to give you in a second just a chance to quickly introduce yourself. But before we do that, I just wanted to give a brief overview about the topics, the things that I'm planning to discuss today. You're one of the leading PRO, CRO experts, I would say. So I think that's always been your thing. I mean, I know you from Parexel. That was always your area of expertise, PRO. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. But in terms of the topics, to just structure our conversation, I think firstly I want to understand, make clear what is COA, what is PRO. I want to then talk a bit about the science of PRO development, some of the regulatory and HTA perspectives. How do those regulatory bodies see PRO instruments? Some practical insights, a bit about the future, your role at ISPOR, and then just they're labeled here as controversial and provocative questions.
Oh,
So
wow.
I hope they're not going to be too provocative. But so that's just the structure. I think, shall we just, before we start, you just want to say a few words, who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So my name is Katja Rüdell. I'm originally from Germany. I've come over to the UK 30 years ago. I studied here as a health psychologist, and I've been working in questionnaire design since then. I trained as a health psychologist. I worked in smoking cessation clinically in the NHS for 2 years, and then I went over into a little bit of drug development and worked for a smoking cessation clinic. And then I decided to do a PhD in questionnaire design.
Very nice, very nice. And did you say you came over to the UK in
1995?
Wow. And since then, you've always been involved in some shape or form in PRO and COA design.
Yeah, just to outline, PROs are patient-reported outcomes.
Right.
That means that they are the way that a patient feels after they've been receiving a treatment for a certain amount of time. And COAs are clinical outcomes assessment. Patient-reported outcomes are a type of clinical outcomes assessment. There are other types, such as observer-reported outcomes that could be reported by, for example, the parent of a child who can't read, and or Alzheimer patients where they cannot be reliably asked about things because their memory isn't so good. And then we have clinician-reported outcomes where the clinician is asked to use their clinical judgment to, for example, rate the severity of a patient. And performance tests, these are the ones where you basically explore whether a patient can count backwards in sevens, and also whether they are able to perform certain tasks like walk a certain length.
So that's more like a cognitive function test, sort of like to assess brain health, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, brain health, and then also physical function. So like the distance you can walk, and or the time you can walk for. Could be things.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you kind of like already you took away the first question that I had, like what is COA, what are PRO outcomes? But okay, that's interesting to understand. So you've got COA, clinical outcomes assessment, right, as like the broader category, and then as a subcategory of that, you've got PRO, patient-reported outcomes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Do you find that when you talk to other people about, you meet somebody at a dinner party that you don't know, you talk about what you do for work, do they instinctively understand what you do for work? And I'm asking this because I always try to explain, for example, to my mom what it is it that you do for work, and I say I do HUR. Like I obviously try to explain it a little bit better, but it needs so many words to explain that. Is it different for you? Do you find it's easy to explain to people?
It is difficult because you do need to understand the clinical environment in which drugs are approved. But I explain to my parents, for example, that I work in drug development and that I evaluate whether the patients that are receiving the new products are having fewer symptoms, and that therefore they need to fill out a symptom diary, and then maybe the symptoms have gone away over time, and that needs to be regularly measured. And so that's more how I explain it, because symptom diaries are actually also PRO, and I do get to develop lots of them. And there's obviously the much more developed areas, such as multidimensional health-related quality of life scales, or the utility scales that you may be using, for example, in your health economic modeling.
Yeah. So that's an interesting connection, right? So like I do HUR. We do a lot of cost effectiveness modeling. As part of that, we need inputs to quantify our health states. We need to assign a certain value to that, just to sort of like say, what is the average quality of life of patients who are in that state. And as you say, it all starts with the patient, right? And we want to capture how the patients are feeling, how they're experiencing a certain health state, and that's not always easy, right? But yeah, certainly an interesting connection there. How can we measure these things in a good way? Okay, so that's interesting. Those are sort of the basics then. What I also wanted to touch on, based on your like sort of career foundation, your career journey, you've said already you've worked through like many different roles. You've worked in the NHS, you've worked in academia as well. I think you worked for multiple pharma companies. Now you work for a consultancy. Sort of like, how has your perspective on PRO research evolved across those different sort of employers? Did it change at all? Was it always the same? Is it, like, I just wanted to see, like, was there any difference? Did you take anything away from the different settings of work from your employers, how you view PRO research?
Well, that's a good question. My view has changed. I worked in academia first in clinical settings, but then, in clinical settings, I was basically recording whether people were smoking cigarettes and how they felt about that. And I felt really frustrated about the way we could help patients who really needed the help most. So the most poorest patients who couldn't communicate well, who didn't have a language to speak. And then therefore I went into more drug development type of things. I also was touched by ethnic minority mental health issues in the east of London. That's how I did my PhD, is just basically assessing whether patients who don't have a language that basically to speak how distressed they are, is how can we find out whether they are actually still distressed? Because if they don't speak our language very well, then how do you find that out? So we were working on a screener measure there. And
sorry to just like jump in on that, because that I find that interesting when you say you've got a language barrier with certain groups that you can't really like measure. You can't just, maybe they don't understand the questions that you ask. Like, what do you then do to overcome that challenge? Like, how do
you look at how in relation to mental health, oftentimes in Eastern cultures, the language surrounding feeling down isn't culturally acceptable. Okay. So you might have to ask, are you able to fulfill the tasks that are asked of you? So that is then a different way how you can sensitively go around that topic, just to explore whether a person feels capable, because that sometimes seems to be one of the concerns with mental health or mental distress. I would say that is the kind of like what we call common mental health disorders. So primary care mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, those kind of, I'm not talking about the more advanced psychotic disorders. That's more difficult to diagnose. But for the ones that show up in primary care, it's very difficult for healthcare professionals to understand what are the signs. And so therefore we were trying to find certain things that actually would help patients who come to the setting to get a better diagnosis and to then be helped with also treatment options that are acceptable to them.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So but that's more about like cultural barriers, right? When you say that in certain cultures, certain behaviors might not be expected or accepted, and therefore you sort of like need to like find a way to phrase your way around that.
Yeah.
Is a language barrier still a problem? I can imagine probably today less so than they were, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, because now you can just like very easily on your phone translate whatever question you might get into whatever language. And
it's more that they use little different pictures. So we all have like pictures of what depression could,
mental images.
Yeah. So they might say something that sounds like, for a German person or a UK person, this is a clear sign that this person might be in a form of distress, and or they might not do the work that they should be doing, or whatever it could be. But I feel, so I think it's more about understanding that that language very well. So I speak English pretty well, but I still certain times I just don't have the vocabulary to fully grasp it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
So we're trying to find really signs and symptoms that would make it easier for healthcare professionals in primary care settings to identify that somebody is in trouble and needs more support. But what I wanted to say is when I look at that academic work that I did in 2004, moving from then on to clinical settings in 2005, I think the academic work was, yes, it was gearing towards a better measure to help patients, but I felt also there was a lot of pressure to innovate or to write things up, and in order to then get more grants, to get more money to help kind of like build that out. And so I felt that was not really where my strength would be. Okay. And it was often about almost you needed to go out there and sell yourself. And that was always my problem. I'm not very good at that. So I didn't enjoy that as much. And so when I had an opportunity to ask Pfizer at the time whether they would fund a studentship for one of our students in one of the universities that I worked for, and they said, "Oh well, we're doing much more research, and we would love you to kind of like work with us on outcome measures." I just grabbed that chance because I did feel like I could help there potentially. I feel pharma products can potentially not only help one person in a clinic, because I felt that they could potentially, with a product, help thousands,
much more scalable,
much larger population. So that was my original idealistic thought of what it would be like to work for a pharma company. And I still think there are lots of people in there who really are ideologically interested in helping people.
I think you find that in our field so much. You find people that are very passionate about what they do, because ultimately at the end of all of what we do, regardless in which niche you're in, there's always a patient somewhere that's hopefully benefiting from whatever treatment is being put out there. So I agree. I think it's a very rewarding field. But just sort of like moving on from what you just said, I as part of like preparation for this podcast, for the interview, I also like did some research on you, and somewhere I found that you described yourself as a passionate patient and ex-caregiver. And I'm just going to ask, how have your personal experiences shaped your approach to patient-centered outcomes research? If is there anything you want to share? If not, personally, perfectly okay. I understand, but I can always see with PRO research, because it's something so close to the patient as compared to something that's more abstract. Like, let's say you're just sitting at the back end doing all the statistics, and everything just becomes a number. You're much closer involved with that. So just that statement, you're a passionate patient and ex-caregiver. How does that personal experience flow into your approach to patient-centered outcomes?
So I had, unfortunately, a big accident when I was in 18, 19, something like this, 1994, I think. So I had an accident. I had a fall. It was dreadful. I had brain bleeding on the brain and a lot of breakages in my pelvis. So I had to lie flat for about 10 weeks until I could move again. And then they put me into a German rehabilitation center which was very good. Actually, I went with all the stroke people. So I had a swimming pool. It was amazing for 12 weeks. And I just was really lucky. I had like a lot of I had a hard time, but I was so young, my brain was still so fresh. There was lots the potential for it to kind of heal was great. So, but I went through lots of thinking and introspection, and basically with 10 weeks lying on flat on your back gives you and just barely surviving, because that was also, I was 10 days in an induced coma. It's kind of like it sort of like focuses your attention on something that is worthwhile doing, how you can have a life that could potentially be worthwhile. I didn't know how good my recovery would be. I'm very lucky that I made it as far as I made it and have almost no lasting effects. So, but I did think that at that time that I really wanted to do something for patients. And I met in my first year at university, I met a lady who was very disabled. She had a form of MS type, it wasn't MS, but it was a form of neurological disorder. And she had phases when she could not walk at all and had to be in a wheelchair. And she told us in the first lesson is that patients have a voice, and we should kind of like make their voice be known. And I was like, oh, you just speak what I want to do. This is amazing. Yeah. So I just was at the right time, meeting the right people. Just happened to be really, goes, yeah.
So when you had that accident, were you already at university or not?
No. It was just I had just finished my A-level Abitur in Germany, and then I had the accident on the 10th of June. I was supposed to start in September university. I had to take a year out. The university was, let me postpone a year. So I had a year basically where I could do physio, ergotherapy, do that swimming in that rehab center, and just lots of bodybuilding. I had to do lots of bodybuilding to gain muscle back again, and all of that, because 10 weeks flat.
Just straight, that's probably not good. But it's so interesting to see that you apparently during that time, sort of like you took the time to reflect, like, and sort of make a plan for life. Like, I want to do something impactful. I want to do this, and then just made that decision. Yeah. Because I feel so oftentimes now, I think, I don't know, it feels to me like that's something that's more prevalent. More, you see it more often now in people when you speak to them, especially younger people. They struggle with all the opportunity that's available to them. They struggle to like pick something. Right? They struggle to like say, I'm going to do this. There's so many options. They could do everything, but like, how do you then decide? And I think with you took that time. You decided, I'm going to do this, and I think that's great.
Yeah, and I thought, to be honest, when I started with psychology, that was the one thing. The only reason why, because I love freedom. I'm very, very. I just like to make decisions on the fly, and I felt that psychology was an area where I could still decide what I wanted to do afterwards with it, because you can go into assessment of people, you can go into treating people, you can go into child psychology, you can do, all sorts of different things, organizational stuff. Yeah, you can do
just
a lot
like work
of
at a corporate job, right?
Yeah. And I just felt that at the time that was something that was worth exploring, because I did also have an interest in what went on in people's brains.
Yeah, that's always interesting, isn't it? Sort of like moving on a bit, sort of into the next category, which I've titled The Science of PRO Development. I've read somewhere that you've conceptualized and validated over 20 new COA instruments. Can you just walk us through the life cycle of developing a patient-reported outcome measure from concept to regulatory acceptance? And then I've got sort of like a second question tied to that. Is like the development of like PRO outcomes like slowing down? Have we sort of like discovered everything? Do we know how to measure PRO now? Like, are we done? Do we just like pull out a drawer, see like we've done this now, like, or is it like constantly evolving?
Yeah. So there's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
let's start with the one, how do you develop a patient-reported outcomes? Because outcomes tool. So a measure as to what is important to patients needs to start with exploring what concepts are there that are affecting the patients. So let's say, for example, for COVID, everybody has got to experience what COVID looks like. But originally, for example, for COVID, we had cough, we had fever, we had headaches, potentially. And then in the later iterations, we had also gastric problems and some other things. Lack of taste, I think, went away in the later versions of the disease. But that sort of understanding what the main symptoms were would then help people understand who develop products, evaluate whether the symptoms went away. So this first talking to the patients, exploring what their perspective is like. Also, is this cough just, let's say, a small, rough cough, or is it like a deep down cough? So these are type of things are important to then see which kind of treatments and which kind of pathways, I guess, are possible treatment avenues. So I think that work is always the start of designing a PRO, so understanding really what are the conceptual building blocks that make up a disease. Then what we normally do is we have to design the questions. So we need to say, okay, a cough, what's important is it the length of the cough? So is it the severity of the cough? How many days you have it? Is it like on a 10 to 0 scale, or some of those things like lack of taste is just a yes or no scale. So you need to kind of like work out what are the right response options for each concept. And then you need to test that with patients. That's often like the second step, is that we'd call this a cognitive debrief. So we show the patients the questions and ask them to answer the questions and tell us what they mean. And sometimes they tell us completely something isn't making sense the way we thought it would.
Yeah.
So those two things are, I think, important for any questionnaire that would make it into a clinical trial. Because if you don't know what you're measuring and you don't know whether patients really understand the questions, could result in you basically generating evidence that isn't interpretable.
Yeah.
And that then will cause regulatory issues, in that the regulators just ask you, where's the evidence, what you've generated? So, and if you don't have that, that kind of makes people disregard all the PRO data.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the first bit.
Yeah.
So that takes 6 months, I would say, at best. So at the shortest time, I think, both of those things.
When you start from scratch, basically.
Yeah. Second piece, do we have all the questionnaires available already? Or do we still need to develop questionnaires? We do have a lot of questionnaires. Actually, there's about 6,000 in one database of a large consultancy, free for use, accessible tool. It's called eProvide. You can get even the public can see the measures in there.
Okay.
But then you can basically license them. But that might cost if you are a pharmaceutical company or a for-profit organization. But you can access at least a lot of them.
And it's all visible.
It's pretty visible, but like particularly for the for-profit companies, they probably put certain things in place. For academia, less so. And those 6,000, not all of them are suitable for drug development because the response options are often not made for drug development. So say, for example, they just look at if it's a screening tool, yes, no is normally the way you define or work out screening tools. But for an outcome measure where you're trying to see is is the symptom getting better, you need sort of a lot more granularity in the response scale.
Yeah.
So that is often something that can be potentially just slightly changed. So you could take an existing tool but change the response scale and make it fit. And also some questionnaires and diseases are very similar. So you could take one questionnaire and say, oh, actually, it also applies in this condition. And I just add one more item or take an item out or something like that. But again, if you want to do that, if it's still worthwhile testing the questionnaire with patients of the new condition. Let's say if you want to see whether an asthma questionnaire is relevant for patients with COPD, there's probably a lot of overlap, but you still should test it in the COPD population, for example.
That makes sense. So sort of like following up from that then, when you say there's this database of 6,000 questionnaires, PRO, COO instruments available, which covers everything that you could possibly do.
A lot.
A lot of what you can do.
Yeah.
How do you then, because I'd imagine that just a few of these instruments are probably used quite a bit more than others, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of like leans into a question like disease-specific quality of life measures versus like more generic quality of life measures. Like what's the difference? Like is one better than the other? Do we need both? Like what is your view on that?
So disease-specific and generic, we need both. And the reason why we need both is that the generic ones help us evaluate where a person is in relation to the general population for a country, or let's say, is an MS patient or an asthma patient, is their quality of life higher than that of a person with terminal stage 4 cancer? Probably. And you need to have a generic measure to basically evaluate that there's a difference between those two types of patients. But if you wanted to evaluate whether a patient actually benefits from a particular product, then it's still worthwhile using the disease-specific instrument, because let's say in the cancer persons, you might see the large points move on the generic tool like the EQ5D, one of those tools where they're basically 5 items: mobility, pain, fatigue, and a few bits. You can see like some trends, but the number one, the response scale is quite crude, and it might not necessarily change over 3 months of being in a clinical trial. So a disease-specific measure, which does actually measure not only, those things, but also like what other symptoms there are, maybe side effects and other bits and pieces that you can see in the EORTC scale, for example, is a lot more able to pick up treatment benefits earlier.
Right. Okay. So I get that we need both from that answer, both generic and disease-specific quality of life questionnaires. What I encounter, though, with like health technology assessment, for example, and that obviously depends in which country you're doing your health technology assessment, there's a pretty strong focus on the generic quality of life measures, right? Because that allows the HTA body to then make assessments across disease areas, and sort of like, because they're always like having to make some sort of budget decision, right? They've got X amount of money to distribute, and they just, if they're doing cost effectiveness analysis, they want to measure comparable benefits. Do you think like the role of the disease specific PRO measures does it really fit in well with the current HTA system? Should it get more relevance?
I think the disease-specific measures are more used to explain to clinicians what the product could do that's relevant to a particular patient. Because the clinicians will be interested in, for example, if a product does cause a side effect, let's say diarrhea, they need to tell the patient who they're prescribing the product for that this cancer product does cause diarrhea, does cause nausea, and therefore the messages that can be gotten from a disease-specific instrument are much more relevant to that clinician that's actually treating the patient. But I understand that it's not really that helpful for a payer body or a HTA body who just needs to evaluate on a broad scale, helicopter view. I've got certain amount of money. I need to distribute it fairly and equally across everyone in this population, and who has the highest need, and how do I measure that need? I just use those 5 parameters. That's how I understand the utility measurement debate.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at my next questions. I think we've already sort of covered the next one. That is something that you said in your ISPOR vision statement. You've advocated for hard to reach and difficult to reach patients who are not able to verbalize their function. I think we sort of like touched on that before.
It's children, actually, I'm mostly thinking about.
Children?
Yeah,
Why is it children?
Because children can't actually talk that well. And oftentimes, I was 18, 19 when I had my accident. And people talk to my parents. They made my parents sort of like answered for me. And I feel like at some point, I was like, I had a passport, I had a possibility to vote. My brain wasn't working properly, but it took a little while to get back to normal. But I did find that very degrading at the time. So particularly, when you're at that age, you think you've got it all together, and you're just like, So that was harsh. And then, but I do also think also for patients with Alzheimer's disease. I've seen that with my grandmother. She suffered from Alzheimer's disease. It's very difficult sometimes for her to get really what things were happening. Couldn't really get it out of her. Yeah. So this is kind of like quite horrifying when you see, if your family suffer through those kind of things.
Absolutely. And I don't have children, but I can imagine that it must be one of the worst things that can happen to you if you see your child suffer from anything, really, right? But makes perfect sense that you say for children it's just difficult to assess because they're just children, right? No, absolutely. Okay, so I think we covered that, the signs of PRO now. Moving on then to like the regulatory and HTA perspectives, which you already touched on a bit. FDA versus EMA and the expectations there, because I think you sit on 2 different like advisory groups for FDA and EMA PRO outcomes. Is that correct?
No. I was part of the COA special interest group at ISPOR.
Right.
So, and we had, as when I was working for Pharma, submitted information regarding PROs to EMA and to FDA, and I had to familiarize myself very much with all the regulatory guidelines in order to advise our product teams what to do and what not to do, and talk to lots of people to get insights into what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing. Mm-hmm. It's almost a witchcraft there in itself. So effectively there's a difference between the 2 guidelines in the European space. The main elements that are regulated are multidimensional quality of life instruments. The regulator has less of a concern regarding diary assessments. They're generally still more or less accepted straight as long as it's published, that you can, they say there's only a certain amount of symptoms that can be in a symptom diary, and therefore they're willing to accept instruments that basically have been developed on the basis of the literature, and as long as it's published, then that's fine. In the US space, you have to go to the COA science division and share whichever diary you have, and also the evidence you used to develop your diary, and they will then say yes, ready to go or not. And that's a different sort of like scenario then. The US regulator basically regulates diaries as well as multidimensional quality of life scales. But both of them are allowing the information to be included in product labels. If you go to them and tell them this is information that you think is important for patients and clinicians to understand the value of the product. And if you do actually provide them with a rationale and you put it at the right point in the assessment hierarchy, because there's a certain way they normally look at the primary endpoint, then the secondary, key secondary, and then wherever it says in that hierarchy, it sort of needs to have enough people in the study to basically give you the statistical significance.
Right. But just like trying to think about and understand all the things you've just said, is it really, if you compare FDA versus EMA, is it just all like minor technical details, would you say, or is it really that like one regulatory body does something like way better than the other, or is it just like minor?
I would say they're pretty close. Yeah. But if you look at, there's always people trying to play them off each other. And it's true that there's more European quality of life labels for pharmaceutical products. But if you look at, for example, the device labels in the US, they have large amounts of quality of life information on their product. So I prefer not to highlight the differences,
right,
or almost like one is easier, one is harder, one is more scientific, and one it's not.
Can't
really
say that.
No, it depends on the product, and also I think it's on evidence.
Fair enough. Just on like the note of like HTA assessments, I think one thing that constantly comes up is just whenever if you've got composite endpoints, right? Like you're trying to measure not one thing, but sort of like multiple things all combined in one composite endpoint. Why is that so challenging, and why do we try to do that in the first place, to cram multiple things into one endpoint? Should we do that? Is it what are the benefits? What are the downsides?
Okay, so I've got an example for you. I developed, or as part of the consortium that developed an instrument for COPD. It's called the Proactive tool. And that is a measure of measuring physical activity, so how much activity a patient can do, together with how many symptoms do they experience. So it's their personal subjective experience of symptoms that they experience while they're active. Now, you could say, well, you could have these two separate, and they would give you information, but ideally you want somebody who walks far and has low symptoms. You don't want to have somebody who exhausts themselves but at the same time has a high level of symptoms. You kind of like, ideally in a treatment scenario, you would treat both of those in one. So it's not great to have one go up and the other one sort of like being possible to be achieved. rather you want to measure both improving at the same time.
Yeah.
And so if you include both in the same assessment, that will also lower the fact that you have to give power to both of those endpoints, and you could have one being successful and the other one basically not being successful. So that's the technical benefit. But the interpretation benefit is then when you come out of the combination of those of those different measures, is that you can say to someone, oh yeah, the proactive tool score went down, but then the clinicians will still want to know, well, what part actually did improve? Was it the symptoms or was it the walking ability? Because I have somebody who's really wants to improve their symptoms and is not so much interested in their walking ability, and so that's the other piece.
And what do you think is that skepticism from HTA bodies around composite endpoints? Is that justified?
Yeah, I think it's justified because it's as I just explained, it's the not understanding what is actually the driver in this assessment. Is somebody trying to hide the driver as well? That's probably some worries that they're having.
Yeah. So would it be easier to achieve, let's say, a positive outcome with a composite endpoint rather than just a single endpoint? Is that a general statement you could make?
I don't know.
'Cause you're measuring like two things at once, and then even if you see like a response in one thing, in the composite endpoint, you're seeing some benefit, whereas like in the other you might not. You just have one variable. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it's too general. You can't really generalize that. But.
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit. I don't know.
Maybe something to think of.
I need to think about it, because I'm just thinking, like, if you could walk a little bit better and your symptoms got a little bit better, like whether the two combined would somehow be automatically giving you higher chances of actually achieving a positive result, versus measuring the first one and failing, and then the second one doesn't actually even get even tested. So at least you tested it, I would imagine. So that might be the argument for the composite endpoint. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there will still be lots of debate about it.
Yeah.
Some more like practical industry insights then. So the next question have it written out in bold, called the shelf life problem, where I think you've mentioned before wanting to generate products that resonate rather than sit on a shelf or being discarded after their first use. So the question there is, what makes the difference between a PRO instrument that gets adopted versus one that gets forgotten?
I think I meant in that relationship not necessarily the PRO instrument, but I meant actually the tablets. So let's say if you have tablets that you try to give patients, there's a lot of scripts that get written where the patients actually take the product one time, but they have so many side effects or so little efficacy that they then will not actually ever come back for a second prescription, and they might even not take the full dose. So to me, that's a waste of resources to have spent years and years of creating the product in the first place, and then it being on a shelf and somebody's not actually using it. So for me, I wish that we would ask more patients more questions whilst they're in the clinical trial about what the product actually does and whether they would continue taking the product. I think we can see sometimes in clinical trials, when I work for Champix, for example, in that clinical trial, I really saw patients sort of like cut the tablets in half and give it to their neighbors and their friends at the time. And so they could really see the benefit of that product at the time, because there wasn't a lot else available for
Right.
people to stop smoking. And I wish we could have recorded some of those things in the clinical trial better. That would then have helped, understand the uptake of the product. But likewise, I think in the clinical trial, sometimes you would also recognize when there's a product that isn't actually working very well. So you just generally realize people don't want to come back to the clinic.
Yeah.
They're just stopping the product. You have lots of missing data. So if you just call them up and say, could you tell me what's the matter, then you get a lot more information, and you might not push those products, or even make the products available. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
No, that makes sense. On the point then of pharma companies not including more PRO outcomes in their clinical trials, I guess that's just like a simple money question. You want to measure more things, it just makes your trial that's already super expensive even more expensive.
Yeah. In particular, if you want to measure it with electronic outcome measures. So you can put these PROs, which are the questions and the response options, on an electronic form, so a smartphone. So programming that all into the smartphone and then getting those shipped to the patients and recorded back to the patient, there is a lot of potential error, a lot of training, a lot of requirements. All of that is adding complexity to the trial, and you could almost, and that all these things are things that a pharma company needs to evaluate whether they will get benefit out of it. And particularly small biotech are just deleting some of those endpoints because they cannot afford it. So they just kind of say, well, I just do what I have to do regulatory wise. And the patient aspect is maybe something that we do later on when the product is already approved and on the market.
Yeah. But it feels like at least nowadays most pharma companies have caught on to the fact that they should probably include EQ5D at least in their clinical trials if they wanted to get it through. Because I think in the past that was also not guaranteed, right?
Yeah.
But now at least that sort of seems to be mostly understood.
Yeah, I think I've read a paper when I looked at I looked at trends for growth in the market, and there was a paper from 2023, and the growth of the pro inclusion or COA inclusion in trials has gone from almost zero in the 1980s to maybe 1 to 2 to 3 now. In 2023, I think was the paper.
1 to 2 to 3 as
including at least 2 or 3.
Oh, the number of PRO measures included, right? Okay.
Yes, so
okay.
So it's going up.
It's going up.
It's definitely
Good. Okay, that's
good.
That's good to see.
Yeah.
All right. So again, I think shifting a bit, different section called strategic and forward-looking. Obviously, you're part of ISPOR. You're part of the ISPOR board as well, like leadership group. What are your top priorities for advancing the field of patient-centered outcomes research?
So my main interest is basically trying to bring the patient perspective into drug development still. And at the last Congress, we had a patient evidence track. I'm hearing that's going to continue for the next one in the US.
Right.
And it was a great success. We had lots of patients who actually came to the Congress, and we offer more patients stipends now to go and travel and understand how health economics work, how outcomes research work, and where they can add their voice. So that I think is helpful, because of the products that land up on the shelf, I think it's much more better if we understand what these patients need, in order to give them what they want, and not just deliver something that just gets marketed.
Interesting. Okay, so it's still about getting the patient perspective more into the R&D phase, even though, as you said, that paper just sort of like speaks about that trend.
Yeah.
2 to 3 PRO outcomes now included in like pretty much every trial.
Yeah, because it's important, I think, also to include the right PROs. So that can only be happening if we understand what it is that the patients want. I think we still have far too few patient satisfaction measures in the trial. We still have far too little productivity instruments in the trial, because that could be really important from a payer perspective, from employer insurance.
Are you talking about like productivity lost due to your illness, basically?
Yes, yeah, like time off work, time where you might have to take care of others. There's a huge burden, caregiver burden, that is shouldered by majority of women caregivers, to be honest about it.
Yeah.
And many have even give up their work just to be caregiving for loved ones, and that has huge economic implications for the societies that we lived in. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of that is probably also happening because just private care, if you wanted to outsource that, let's say,
it's hugely expensive.
And then maybe also people don't feel comfortable with that, right? They say I'd rather do it myself rather than just do somebody else.
It as well. Yeah, they rather, and the patients don't like it either. So they feel there are more chances of them being subject to abuse in some care homes. You know, so I know another caregiver story is my mother-in-law had cancer, and she decided to stay in our house for her final days rather than go to a hospice. I think that's a choice. I think if the family can allow for that and can make it happen and wants to make it happen, I think that's a great thing. But I don't know where I was going with this.
No, but I think it's just such a subjective decision as well, and you're sort of balancing between the patient with the disease, maybe they're older, they need whatever care they might need, and then the carer itself, which they're like most likely making sacrifices if they're doing the care, and like sort of like you can understand both perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. Right? It's hard work, and also, you know, if to some extent the choice when I went through that situation, and we decided as a family to take my mother-in-law in our house, it was COVID time, so the choices were either have her in a house and accompany her through that journey on her last days, or like potentially have her in a hospice and not see her through that time. And that was just, you know, there were stark choices. If it wouldn't have been so black and white almost, maybe that we would have taken different choices. You know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the next bit about is like titled Training the Next Generation. I think you're passionate about mentoring young researchers.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, like, what skills or mindset do you think are missing in the current generation of PRO scientists, and where do you think young researchers, somebody who's just starting out today, basically like maybe they've just graduated, where should they go? What's missing currently? What should they focus on?
I don't think there's anything missing currently. I'm actually quite happy with all the young staff that I see coming through. I see a lot of people interested in patient experience. I think there's a lot of health psychologists still being trained. There's clinical psychologists, there's nursing students who have got that interest in the patient experience. And I think the main task for somebody who wants to get into that field is to train a little bit in statistics to understand how questionnaires need to look and how response scales need to look in order to identify a treatment effect.
Yeah.
And ideally also do some patient research with asking patients and doing interview testing. So I did that early on. I did a bit of market research as well. Just getting people and keeping them talking is an important skill set as well. Yeah. So you can do all sorts of tasks to actually train yourself up. Yeah.
No, but I think if people ask me, also I think that applies more generally, not just to PRO research. If you wanted to get in like the pharma or healthcare, life science industry in general, I think the one thing I would always say is like do the basic of statistics. Like that's, regardless of what you do, that will always help you.
Yeah.
Because you just need to understand the data in order to make evidence-based decisions, right? Like that's just at the core of all of what we do. Right. I'm just thinking about, I think maybe let's move on to the next section, which is the controversial or provocative question. So let's go for that. I've titled this question, are we measuring what really matters? I think it said somewhere, you've done over 200 projects in outcomes research. What proportion of PRO endpoints do you think actually capture what patients care most about?
A lot of them do. I mean, I think all of them do something. I mean, particularly if they're made from the patient perspective. With the EQ5D, I've seen sometimes examples of where an EQ5D was kind of thrown in, like an HTA assessment, but not understanding that the EQ5D was not relevant to a patient, because they didn't look at what the questions were, and they couldn't really work out whether this would actually improve or not. So, but that's kind of like more. That's, for example, just because there could be other things that are happening where the patient might, for example, there's always a question like, does the EQ5D doesn't measure vision or doesn't measure sleeping issues? So some of these things do improve, but it isn't measured in the EQ5D, mm-hmm. So you're not actually, capturing any benefit, and therefore that's kind of just lost information. So I that's why I've also would say I would always include another tool that is closer to the patient experience than the generic tools. That's relates to creating or using instruments that are actually patient friendly.
Is it fair to summarize when I say that basically no PRO instrument is perfect, and you always have to like contextualize it and basically know what you're looking at?
There's some that are pretty close to perfect, but I think there were instruments that were developed on asthma, for example, where I'm always really surprised at how good the data reads out, and how it really differentiates how patients start from A and end up with B, and they look a lot better than certain things that have changed in the way that they feel about their breathing. Mm-hmm. I think whether you have other more complicated measures or diseases, it's a little bit harder, and no treatment that works. That's the other piece, is maybe you don't have the treatment that works to show the difference, right?
Yeah. So how do you then, when you say some PRO measures are close to perfect, or at least really, really good, what makes up a good PRO instrument? Like how do you Like, how do you judge that? Do you say you look at the data and you say, I think you said the data reads out well. Like, what is it?
So so you need to have an outcome measure that's responsive to change. That's the most important thing. So if person A has got, I don't know, pain on a scale of 10, they take an analgesic, and after 3 hours they're on a pain of 5. Then
10 being like the highest.
10 being the worst
Yeah.
possible pain
Yeah.
imaginable, and then in an hour they're on a 5. That would be a positive outcome. The tool works, the product works, and the patient feels better. So this is kind of like the 3, you've done it. Sometimes you have a measure where, because you have yes and no, have I improved or not? Maybe a patient after an hour will just say, well, not enough, so I know I'm still in pain. So even though I've improved 5, I'm still in pain. So no. And then sometimes you have a product that doesn't actually improve anything at all. So you kind of like, that is a possibility that you just you just can't see the change.
Sure.
But yeah, in a positive way, things should kind of like move in the right direction if both of them are happening. If you've got the right response scale and the patient is improving and the product is working, then you've got the magic that makes up great new products that could make it to the market. But if you're choosing the wrong measure, or you're having not a good product, then the chances, unfortunately, that could be a disaster as well. But that's why you need people like me.
I'm sure many people will be very happy to do and contract with you to get expertise on PRO measurement. How do you then, just on the note of like what qualifies as good PRO instruments, how do you sort of like reconcile the treatment satisfaction paradox that you work on all these like different PRO measures, but sometimes patients might be satisfied with a certain treatments, but the treatment doesn't actually meaningfully improve actual like clinical outcomes. How, like, what do you do in such a situations when the patient, maybe they might be saying like, yeah, I think this product is good, but there's nothing you can actually measure about that?
If you can't show anything, chances are a regulatory body or an HTA body will just kind of like say, well, that's just then the same as the product we already have. So that are the risks. But if you've got patient evidence that at least they prefer the formulation, or they say it's more convenient, it actually makes me adhere to the product better. These are just small differentiated, because nobody hates something more than unused medication. As I said about the products staying on the shelf, it's worse giving a prescription about something that the patient uses once and never uses again than, say, give a prescription that at least they're going to continue using and getting better benefit from. So if they're feeling better with it, that is important.
I think in interesting aspects, like you mentioned, something that is, when you talk about like treatment adherence, like the convenience of like how easy is it to use a certain, taking a pill like just once a month, once a year, that's certainly easier than, having to go someplace to a remote treatment facility to get like an infusion for like 3 hours or something like that, right?
Yes.
So that certainly has an impact on how patients perceive a treatment, and we want to capture that as well. Yeah. And I think a lot of that is just captured intuitively. Like everyone understands that just taking a pill, that's easier than just going somewhere and like having to spend all that time. But is there also a need to like measure that somehow?
Yes. And I'm very happy that I can bring the company in that I work for, because that's our one of our key offerings is patient preference research. So we conduct surveys to evaluate different attributes that patients are asked to evaluate. So, like for example, the infusion versus oral is often an issue that is relevant for schizophrenic patients because they often have maybe a lack of insight when they're really active, and they therefore might not take the oral products. And then sometimes, so they evaluate over long term, do they rather want to be well and have a depot infusion over 6 months or so, and or take the gamble and sort of like maybe then have delusions and so forth.
So trade-offs in terms
of we evaluate that, and different patients make different decisions on that whole basis. So it's very interesting to see what they prefer. So
interesting.
Yeah.
I think we've arrived at like the closing question, which is titled "The One COA Change." If you could mandate one change in how the pharmaceutical industry approaches patient-reported outcomes tomorrow, what would that be and why?
I would love it if we would have better ePro uptake and adoption and better technology. That would be my
ePro being like electronic.
I do think, and I've seen a lot of that suffering in the clinics, at the sites where the actual practitioners who have to hand out the ePros are just phobic of e-technology or smartphones or other things that are would make the patient's way to record actually how they're feeling and how the product is affecting them. It would give us so much more knowledge in the drug development cycle. If we wouldn't have so much missing data in ePro, we would be so much further in drug development because we would really understand what are the symptoms that are improving, what are the things that are going well with the product. And I feel we're still kind of missing a lot of data. So that's my biggest concern.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you say more uptake of electronic PRO measures. That's your one thing.
Or you could interview patients also, like read out the questions on them and collect the data, just like that. And I would love.
That would almost be the opposite of just doing it electronically, right?
Yes.
The one's about like convenience, and the other one is, I guess, about like intensity, right? Like somebody sitting in a room and just reading something out. So if you had to just rough proportions, I would have imagined that in like end of 2025, most PRO outcomes should be electronic in some form. Is that not the case? Is it still like most of them are like like physical, paper-wise?
Well, it's sort of like it depends on how much money the sponsor has and what the intent is. So a lot of the biotech's intent is just to sell the product to a large pharma to then commercialize it, so they don't want to invest. And a lot of the HTA bodies, well, they will work around or try to work around how they can lower the price. So therefore, they don't really demand the PRO data necessarily. They're just happy, well, if the sponsor doesn't present it, then I don't have to give them top dollar. So they're just kind of like not really that interested in it. And I personally feel we've put an ethical obligation. We're putting lots of patients through this whole new product, and we should know how they're feeling about it. It would make sense, wouldn't it?
It would make sense. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. So, but I don't think I think the system is played in such a way that you can't almost turn it. You wouldn't need certain things would just need to change, I think.
Let's see if they will. Maybe 2026 is going to be the year where COA is going to the moon, and PRO uptake is just increasing. Maybe there'll be 5 or 10 PRO outcomes in every trial.
No, not 10.
That would be too much. What's your number?
My number is 4. I'm
4.
like
4 is the good.
Yeah, symptom measure, side effect measure, functioning, and utility tool. There you go.
Perfect. Well, you said it. That's it. Perfect. Thank you so much, Katja. I really appreciate you taking the time again. And thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.